3. Stages of revolution in Greece. A. Ascending stages. 1. The dictatorship of a fascist general. In 1932, the Comintern sets out to create anti-fascist popular fronts with the aim of resisting the coming of fascists to power. Effectively, that means a course for a coalition of communist parties with bourgeois parties. May 9, 1936. Execution of workers in Saloniki. See in Wikipedia regime of August 4th. Quote, after these events, Ioannis Metaxas raised the issue of dictatorial rule at a meeting with the king. Emergency measures were applied within the framework of growing intensity in international relations and the looming threat of a European conflict. End of quote. They were concerned about the civil war in Spain and the growing threat of a world war. On August 5, 1936, the Greek trade unions planned a general strike. Therefore, on August 4th, General Metaxas established his dictatorship. Communists are tortured, exiled to islands where people are not allowed to drink, etc. For more details, see information on the Greek Himmler. Quote, out of 17,000 communists at the beginning of the German occupation, no more than 4,000 survived, and 2,000 people were in prisons and concentration camps on the islands in the Aegean Sea, according to Wikipedia. In the USSR, repression against all communists, including Greeks, is intensifying. They are accused of participating in counter-revolutionary Greek organizations. By September 1938, 21,000 Greeks were killed and 30,000 were sent to the Gulag. 2. The beginning of the World War. Communists in defense of the fatherland. September 1st, 1939. The beginning of the Second World War. The Italian invasion of Greece in 1940. Greece defeats the invasion of Italians, the fascist regime of Metaxas against the fascist regime of Mussolini. Greek communists participate in the defense of their country, the very one that tortured them, killed, sent to the islands. Here is an excerpt from an open letter of General Secretary of the Communist Party of Greece, Zachariadis, to the people of Greece from October 1940. In this war, which is led by the government of Metaxas, all of us must offer all their efforts without doubts. The reward for the working people and the capstone of today's struggle will be a new Greece of work and freedom, liberated from any foreign imperialist dependence, with a true popular culture. Everyone to the struggle, each one to his position. and the people will be a victory of Greece, and the victory will be a victory of Greece and the Greek people. End of quote. In general, Greek communists prefer their own fascism to Italian fascism. An excellent choice. Note that the Greek communists act similarly to the Ukrainian leftists who support Ukraine, led by Zelensky, against the invasion of the Russian army, led by Putin. Thus, they support their oligarchic regime, which is clearly supported by Uncle Sam, against Putin's oligarchic regime. April 1941. German troops invaded Greece. The country is occupied by the Germans, Italians, and Bulgarians. Hunger and repression against the local population. 3. The beginning of resistance. The policy of the Popular Front. The decision to start resistance comes from the depths of the people. It began to form spontaneously. The Greek resistance, like that of the proletariat, the petite bourgeoisie, and the peasantry, did not emerge from any organizational decision. Likewise, it was outside any organizational framework that on the night of 31st of May 1941, two students scaled the Acropolis and tore down the swastika from it. Andrea Kedros describes this as a madly daring and splendidly gratuitous act. For him, it became the symbol of the Greek refusal to submit. The CP of Greece began to organize resistance to the fascists only after Germany invaded the territory of the USSR, which was in June 1941. Before that, the Germans were friends with Stalin, and therefore the Greek communists, being loyal Stalinists, did not dare to start a fight against the invaders on their own land. According to the plan of the Communist Party of Greece, the Greek resistance was supposed to have a national character and be a form of popular front. The EAM, founded in September of 1941, only accepted a national basis for struggle. It refused to consider social liberation and address the nation regardless of classes. It concentrated on attempting to attract support from the upper strata of society and kept silent on the demands of the workers. We have already seen a similar policy at the beginning of the war, during the invasion of the Mussolini regime. A little later, armed resistance, led by the Communist Party of Greece, begins to form in the mountains. Wikipedia writes, after Germany's offensive campaign in the Soviet Union, the Greek Communist Party championed the creation of the National Liberation Front, EAM, and Claras was sent to central Greece, Greek Roumeli, to assess the potential for the development of a guerrilla movement against the occupation forces in this area. His proposals were adopted by the party, and in January 1942, Claras moved to the mountains to start setting up guerrilla groups. Claras is Athanios Claras, The battle name was Aris Velouchiotis, the leader of the communist armed resistance until his death in 1945. The first military appearance of the partisans, led by Aris Velouchiotis, dates to June 1942. Then he introduced himself to the peasants as Aris, which means the god of war in Greek. Velouchiotis was the name of a local mountain. When the detachment of Aris Velouchiotis entered a village, the first thing he did was explain the goals of Allahs to the local peasants. Thus, we see that a true revolutionary leader acts first of all by persuasion, and only then with the use of violence. Initially, in the detachment of Aris Velouchiotis, there were only 15 people. Fidel Castro had 12 in Cuba. Aris established iron discipline in the detachment. In this, he resembles Kovpak, a leader of the Soviet Ukrainian partisans during the Patriotic War. Over time, the detachment of Aris grew to 50,000 men and women, according to Wikipedia. The first actions of the detachment of Aris were acts of sabotage of the means of communication and transport of the Germans. At the beginning of the war, communist partisans act together with liberal partisans, IDES, People's Republican Greek League. The British helped both, since at the beginning of the war, the main objective for them is to hold back Hitler's army, even if it is necessary to, quote, say a word of kindness in reference to the devil in the House of Commons, end of quote, in the words of Winston Churchill. For the same reason, they half-heartedly help the USSR. Wikipedia writes, one of the most important early operations of the Greek resistance movement, in which Velouchiotis and his fighters, after negotiations with the British, agreed to participate alongside Napoleon Zervas's Republican IDES resistance forces and 12 British saboteurs under the leadership of Major E.C.W. Eddie Myers, was the blowing up of the Gorgo-Potamos railway viaduct south of Lamia on November 25, 1942, Operation Harding. The British thus hoped to weaken the supply of General Rommel, who fought against the British armed forces in North Africa. Later, the communist partisans moved on to seize entire districts and establish self-government for the people. Quote, a report by the German Abwehr in November 1942 mentioned that whole districts of Greece were in the hands of the guerrillas, who executed traitors, distributed the corn which they collected by forced levies, and who called upon the villagers freely to elect their representative leaders and to discuss all their problems in a democratic manner. End of quote. Courts were established in villages headed by popular leaders. Like the Soviets of the Russian Revolution, the Greek People's Councils were the seeds of a new workers' and peasant state, as a Greek peasant told an American agent inquiring about what post-war Greece would look like. Quote, "It will be a type of the government where the common people run the country." End of quote. Let us add that at this moment, the security battalions, troops that serve the German fascists and fight on behalf of the government in Athens, are operating against the Greek partisans. 4. Democrats against communists. After the end of the war, the British, or rather the Foreign Office, wanted to keep Greece in their sphere of influence because it was a way of communication with Egypt and India, rich British colonies. The British predicted that after the end of the war, they would have to clash with Hellas in the struggle for power. Therefore, already in 1943, they made a secret decision to destroy Hellas and support Ides. Military aid to communist partisans from Britain ends immediately. The operation to blow up the bridge in Gorgopotamus was the last friendly interaction between liberal and communist partisans. After that, skirmishes begin. In July 1943, all partisan groups, primarily Hellas and Ides, signed an agreement under which they undertook to work together against the German fascists under the leadership of the English General Wilson, the so-called National Benz Agreement. It can be called the first agreement of communists with the bourgeoisie. However, despite the formal agreement, mutual dislike and mistrust continue. Resistance to the fascists takes on a national character. It was not only in rural areas, but also in the cities. Quote, "The mass movements in the cities were irrepressible. There was a general strike in Athens on the 25th of June 1943 against the execution of hostages by the occupying power. The tram driver strike, which began on 12th of June, had led to 50 tramway workers being sentenced to death. They were saved by the general strike. By 1944, not only were wide rural areas liberated, but the German troops lived under siege in the cities, which they could only leave in guarded convoys." End of quote. In the fall of 1943, Italy capitulates. Communist partisans capture warehouses with weapons left by the Italian troops. The Germans enter their troops in Greece instead of the Italians. The Communist Party of Greece organizes its own security service, the OPLA, the main point of which is directed against the Trotskyists and leftists in its ranks, not the German collaborators. Quote, "The Stalinists removed in one way or another any Trotskyists who managed to win responsible positions in the Hellas or in the People's Army. Furthermore, between October and December 1944, the OPLA, which was really a Greek GPU, mounted a campaign of extermination against the Trotskyists. Throughout the country, OPLA agents abducted, tortured, and murdered such militants as Stavros Verouchis, the secretary of the Association of the War Wounded, Thanasis Economou, former secretary of the Communist Youth at Gazi. Workers, dockers, metal workers, and teachers all suffered alike. We killed more than 800 Trotskyists, boasted Barzotas, a member of the Communist Party of Greece Political Bureau in 1947. Thus, the following were lined up against the left movement in communism. 1. Stalin, the so-called socialist camp. 2. Churchill, the so-called democracy. And their faithful transmission belt, the Greek Communist Party. 5. Mutiny of free troops in Egypt. After the German invasion, the government of Greece, headed by the king, ran away to Egypt under the protection of Churchill. Among the Greek troops in Egypt, riots began in support of Hellas. This is what Peter Bruegel writes about the episode. First, on March 31, 1944, the Soviet ambassador refused to receive a delegation of soldiers and sailors. They hoped to make the representatives of the Soviet government understand that they were fighting against fascism in their own ranks, but instead they saw only closed doors. Secondly, quote, in Egypt, the mutineers had their backs to the wall. The 1st Brigade arrested its Metaxist officers, reorganized its command, and refused to hand over its arms as a prelude to internment. The movement spread to the Navy, to the destroyer Pindos, the cruiser Averov, the Ajax, and several more. The crews elected a mixed committee of men and officers. The British ambassador to the Greek government in Cairo, Reginald Leeper, telegraphed to Churchill, "What is happening here among the Greeks is nothing less than a revolution." On 13th of April 1944, Admiral Cunningham announced that he had decided to put down the rebellion by force, and if necessary, to sink the Greek ships in the very roadstead of Alexandria. The mutinous land formations were surrounded, deprived of water, and starved out. On the 22nd of April, a successful raid was made on the Ajax by the leading Metaxist Admiral Voulgaris. The other ships lay under British guns and surrendered. General Paget launched his tanks against the 1st Brigade, and it also surrendered. Within a few days, some 20,000 Greek volunteers of the Army of the Middle East found themselves in concentration camps in Libya and Eritrea. End of quote. B. Descending stages of the revolution. 6. Conference in Lebanon. The second deal with the bourgeoisie. After the mutiny of the Greek army in Egypt in May 1944, the British hold a conference in Lebanon with Edess and Iam Elas and give some secondary seats in the future government to the representatives of Iam Elas, 6 out of 24 to be precise. Thus, the communists who have real power in Greece make a deal with the shadow of the bourgeois parties, which have no power in the country. Power in Greece had to be taken in the autumn of 1944, when Iam Ilas had strength, when the Germans were still in the country. The Communist Party of Greece had 435,000 members in October of 1944, according to Wikipedia. Communist partisans controlled 90% of the country's territory. Having missed this moment, taking a course on cooperation with the bourgeois parties, the Communist Party of Greece doomed itself to defeat in the long run. The moment advantageous for taking power cannot last long. If the left does not take power, then the right will restore it. At the Moscow Conference between Stalin and Churchill, which took place in October of 1944, during the secret percentage agreement, 90% of the influence in Greece went to the British and 10% to the USSR. According to another source, this agreement was reached even earlier in Tehran in the autumn of 1943. Based on these agreements, Stalin surrenders the Greek communist resistance to the British. Quote, after the April 1944 crisis, the government in exile in Cairo was entrusted to George Papandreou, who helped to develop the anti-communist movement. Under his pressure, the leaders of the EAM and Alas signed on 30th of May 1944 the Lebanon Charter, which denounced Allah's terrorism, the indiscipline of the mutineers, many of whom served sentences for it, left open the question of the monarchy, and agreed to a single command of the Greek armed forces and to the re-establishment of order alongside the Allied troops at the liberation. The EAM Alas were unhappy at this, and for several weeks bargained and demanded ministerial posts and a change of prime minister. Soon, a Soviet mission led by Colonel Popov arrived and put an end to these ill-tempered grumblings. The Communist Party of Greece and the EAM unconditionally entered the government. When the German forces left Athens on 12th of October 1944, the Communist Party of Greece called on the Greek people to ensure public order. It also ensured that Papandreou came to power. He arrived with the British forces at a time when the Hellas exercised real power all across the country. Thus, Stalin ordered the Communist Party of Greece to ensure that Papandreou, an ardent communist, came to power. 7. Agreement in Caserta, the third deal with the bourgeoisie. In connection with the general offensive of the Red Army units, the Germans begin evacuation from Greece. Anticipating the German withdrawal from Greece, communist rebels and the bourgeoisie signed an agreement in Caserta, September 1944. According to these agreements, the English General Scobie becomes the head of all armed forces in Greece. The partisans of the warring parties are invited to unite for a common struggle. 6 days after the departure of the Germans, British troops land in Greece, October 1944. An armed counter-revolution is being prepared in the country. A correspondent for The Nation writes from the Athens, quote, "Thousands of traitors and quislings were permitted to roam freely around Athens. No collaborators were called to trial or punished by the government. Royalist organizations were secretly armed. Members of the Nazi-organized security battalions were spirited out of prison and armed. Wild stories of red terrorism were fed to the local and foreign press. High officials of the various ministries who had faithfully served the Nazis and Quisling government were kept at their posts. No attempt was made to purge the police and National Guard, both of which had worked for the Gestapo. When the Undersecretary of War, on November 24th, appointed 14 officers to organize a new National Guard, 8 of them were former officers of the security battalions. The Mountain Brigade was withdrawn from Italy and brought to Athens. More British troops kept landing in Greece, and long after the last German had left the Greek mainland, British tanks rumbled along the streets of Athens. End of quote. 8. December events and the fourth deal with the bourgeoisie. The British are demanding that both sides be disarmed, but this is mainly about Hellas. The commanders refuse to do this, and as a result, the December events of 1944 occur. That is, an open, armed struggle between some Hellas units and British troops. The leadership of the Communist Party refuses to send its troops to Athens. There is numerous evidence for this. For example, a 1983 interview with General Marcos Vefiadis. As a result, the British troops are victorious. Winston Churchill, with a nod towards Stalin, reported that the British troops had won a victory over triumphant Trotskyism, meaning by this the left movement in the Communist Party. The British knew a little about the currents in communism and knew how to be diplomatic. After the defeat on the streets of Athens, the Warkiza Agreement, February 1945, was concluded, according to which both sides were to disarm, and the British troops are supposed to be the guarantor of this. However, only communists are disarmed. Fascist accomplices remain with weapons. The White Terror begins. Communists are shot or taken to camps on the islands. 9. The left wing of the Communist Party, led by Aris Valouchiotis, decides to continue the armed struggle. Aris, who personally signed the Treaty of Arwakiza on behalf of Hellas, considered that they had been betrayed and decides to continue the fight, moving with an armed detachment into the mountains of central Greece. Aris, calling on the communists for a new struggle, says, "The English are even worse than the Germans. If they succeed, they will impose a fascist regime with another name. Aris, in his letter to the party, writes about the dynamics of events. Until Lebanon, the EAM followed an ascending line of development. From then on, it started its downward spiral. From the Battle of Athens and its defeat, and even more so after the Warkiza Agreement, it started to rapidly lose its influence. In his last letter to the Communist Party of Greece, dated March 1945, Aris was still convinced that the Soviet Union was striving for a world revolution, but it did not have time to devote to the Greek drama. Quote, the Soviet Union is making policy for the world revolution, and so, as you know, cannot energetically intervene in the drama of Greece, nor can it do so for Serbian, Bulgarian, or even Russian politics. With its world revolutionary perspective, it is unable to rescue the small part of humanity called Greeks, but will slowly but surely lead us to the total victory of the politics of the world revolution. In this, they cannot but be on the side of socialism. The leadership of the Communist Party of Greece, headed by Zachariadis, named Aris suspicious and adventurous element, and kicked him out of the party. Subsequently, the Communist Party of Greece apparently surrendered the detachment of Aris to government troops, which leads to the decapitation of Aris and his assistant. 10. The final stage of the armed struggle, DSE, led by Marcos Vafiadis. Parts of the communists continue to resist. The new name of the armed communist resistance is DSE, Democratic Army of Greece, formed in December of 1946. They have bases in Yugoslavia, led by Tito, Albania, led by Haksa, and Bulgaria, led by the Soviet protege Dimitrov. The government army that opposes the DSE recruits officers who previously served in the German army in the ranks of the security battalions. The newly reorganized Greek army has among its officers 1,262 men who served the Germans in the German organized and German commanded security battalions, all of whose names are available. The leadership of the Communist Party is in favor of turning the partisan detachments into a regular army, while they are not yet ready for open clashes with government troops. This is an interesting zigzag. In the beginning, the leadership of the Communist Party of Greece was against any armed resistance to the British and government troops, and then it is for the instantaneous transformation of the partisans into a regular army. Such zigzags are typical for the Stalinists. For example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, and demoralizes the core of the party. After the death of Aris Velukiotis, Marcos Vafiadis becomes the head of the communist armed resistance. Wikipedia writes, in February 1946, Marcos Vafiadis disagreed with Nikos Zachariadis, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Greece, who wanted to create a standing communist army. Vafiadis believed that the forces of the Greek government were too strong, and the best option for the Communist Party of Greece was a guerrilla struggle. However, Marcus Vafiadis was forced to bow his head before the leadership of the Communist Party of Greece and wages a regular war against government troops. At this time, the British are running out of money to help the Greek government, and they turn to the United States for help. Truman provides assistance to the Greek government, as well as Turkey, which at that time was under pressure from the USSR. The total amount of American aid is $400 million. The Americans are supplying the Greek government with military equipment, including warplanes, to fight the partisans. In addition, the Americans sent about 200 military advisors to Greece. The DSC is trying to capture the cities, but they don't have enough strength. 20,000 against 90,000 government troops reinforced by the American technology and advisors. As a result, the guerrillas are defeated in open battles. In 1948, Yugoslavia, headed by Tito, has broken off from the USSR, headed by Stalin. In the Greek Communist Party, a struggle begins with the supporters of Tito. They are expelled from the party. Tito stops sending help the Greek communist partisans and concludes an agreement with the United States in order to resist the USSR. Suffering military defeats, having lost external assistance, and experiencing severe material difficulties, the Greek partisans are forced to cross over to Albania, where they are evacuated by Soviet ships to the USSR. Partisan supporters in Greece are either killed or imprisoned. Those Greek communists who were not shot are sent to camps where they are tortured by former LS commanders who signed papers of repentance. The head of the Communist Party of Greece is settled in Tashkent, in fact on prison terms. He tries to return to Greece, but was refused by his own government. Then the Soviet leadership, led by Khrushchev, deports him to Surgut, where he commits suicide. The Greek Society of Archaeo-Marxists sends congratulations to its government on the end of the war. We are waiting for similar messages from Marxist.org, for example, on the issue of the war in Ukraine. After the war, the US has complete control over civil society in Greece. Politics, labor unions, salaries, journalists, welfare, and so on. In general, it turns out a picture worthy of being called a modern Greek tragedy, in which both the Stalinists and pseudo-Trotskyists, as well as Democrats and the common people of Greece, participated. And finally, conclusions. 1. In essence, the outcome of any revolution comes down to the struggle of factions within the revolutionary party, to the influence on this party of other parties, national and transnational, as for example, the CPSU influenced the KKE. That is why the analysis of what is happening on the left around the world is so important. And now it is easy to do as the focus is on the war in Ukraine. 2. A true revolutionary leader acts first of all by persuasion, and only then by force. Examples are Leon Trotsky, Aris Veluchiotis, and Fidel Castro. 3. Any national liberation war, if it is really called upon to be a national liberation war, becomes a revolution. The most recent example of this are the events in Afghanistan and the departure of the Americans in 2021. 4. The surest way to be defeated is to unite with hostile forces. This is true both personally and politically. Marcus Raffiadis says, "We made compromises." I must add, rotten compromises that betrayed the essence to the enemy in exchange for the shadows. And 5. For victory in the class struggle, for the seizure of power, there is a relatively short period of time when the revolutionary class forces are on the rise, and the enemy is frightened and few in number. It is necessary to achieve the seizure of power during this period. If the left does not take power, then the right will restore it. End of Thermidor in the Greek Revolution. Please write your comments at internationalleft@protonmail.com. Thank you for listening.